Today, I woke up and chose violence. We just got back from Cinegear 2026, and we're gonna be talking about why gear doesn't matter at all. Let's jump into it. Well, it still matters a little bit. I mean, actually, in a way, it matters a lot. Let's jump into it. That's confusing. Both things can be true at the same time, I think, right? Okay, let's really jump into it. All right, today is definitely a gear video, and in honor of gear, let's make this a little more interesting. Boop. That'll never get old. These Godox lights are awesome. So as mentioned, we just got back from Cinegear 2026 in Los Angeles, California. It was at Universal Studios on the back lot, which is always a cool way to do it because you kind of feel like you're on set while you're looking at all this awesome gear. I got to catch up with some companies and some people I haven't spoken to in a while, and I got to meet some cool people for the first time. I also got to catch up with my friends over at Panasonic, who I got to speak for on a panel at Cinegear a few years ago, as well as NAB. Nowadays, I go to these conventions to meet friends, new and old, and to do some networking. I'm not really interested in the gear as much anymore. And as the years go on, this interest gets less and less. And I thought I'd just make a video and kind of wax poetic about gear and whether or not it's that important. So we're mainly going to be talking about cameras, lenses, and lighting. Now, if you don't want to sit through this whole video, then the obvious answer is yes, gear matters because that's literally what we use to create images. But I do believe we have a problem with overthinking it. In a lot of cases, it does not matter nearly as much as you think it does. Now, when I was first starting out, I was shooting on things like a GH2 and a Sony FS100. The gap was pretty far between cameras like that and something like an ARRI Alexa. You could notice all of the differences pretty much instantly. And even then, I really liked the cameras I was using. So to give this video some overall context, the FS100, when I bought it, was around $4,000. It shot 1080p up to 60 frames per second. It had no log profile, and I think it was something like an 8-bit H.264 codec. And all that said, it still produced some pretty awesome images. At the time being, I was happy with it. Now, you go to things like Cinegear, and there are cameras that are half as much that shoot 6K, full frame, log profiles, even red raw, like the Nikon ZR that we're shooting on right now. My point is, the gap has closed and continues to close a significant amount. It's even closed a mathematical amount. What I mean by that is the cameras I started with to kind of maximize the perceived dynamic range took a lot of light. For example, if I wanted to see outside of a window and I was shooting on something like the FS100, I would have to raise the ambient light inside probably by something like 5 to 6 stops. Now on cameras like the ZR or the FX3 or the Canon C50, you just need to raise the ambient light a couple stops inside in order to see outside the window. So we can kind of see from a mathematical point of view how much the gap has closed to get to something closer like an ARRI Alexa. Okay, that's a lot of mumbo jumbo, but what I really mean to say is if you light properly, you really can almost not tell the difference between any of these cameras anymore. The sensors are so good and they all perform amazing. So in that context, I don't think cameras matter anymore. You can pretty much grab anything that's somewhat modern and get a wonderful image. Where I think cameras do matter is for your workflow. Whatever workflow is specific to you or to the project that you'll be on. I'm not trying to shun cinema cameras. They absolutely still have their place. If I was shooting a bigger budget feature film, I would want a cinema camera on set. They're streamlined to make everybody's workflow easier, but they require a lot more. They require bigger crews, a bigger team, and more gear to get them to work properly. If you have a big cinema camera setup, you can't get away with a rinky-dink tripod, and then that just trickles up. You can't have a little makeshift jib, you need something like a crane. You can't have a pistol grip gimbal, you need a full-size gimbal that can handle the weight, or a Steadicam. So yes, cinema cameras definitely have their place, and they all perform extremely well, but they do require more. If I was working with a skeleton crew or a lower budget film, I would be more than happy just using my Nikon ZR. It's gonna be more flexible and I'll be able to do more with it in a quicker amount of time. That's just gonna cut costs and allow us to do more in front of the camera. Now, I've said that before, I will definitely say it again. What you put in front of the camera is going to matter infinitely more than the camera that you're using. So anytime a director comes to me and says, hey, this is kind of our budget, it's fixed, we need to make it work. What camera do you want to use? My response is always, let's cut whatever costs we can on the camera package and put it in front of the camera. That could be hair, makeup, special effects, locations, better actors, whatever it is, it's gonna be better in front of camera rather than in the camera package itself. Now, I loved gear when I was starting out, so I'm not saying don't love gear and don't investigate new camera systems, but I've been there and a lot of my colleagues have been there, where the further along in your career that you get, the less you care about things like cameras. And if you're not there yet, you probably will be at some point. And that's just years of experience seeing what actually affects the image and what doesn't affect it that much. And again, because the gap has closed so much, the camera just really doesn't affect the image that much these days. You just have to know the sensor you're working with and light and expose for that sensor. I guarantee you, if you do that, you can get an incredible result. So what are some other things that affect the image? Well, that brings me to lighting. Cinegear had a ton of cool lighting. Although I blinded myself probably 17 times looking at all the lights, it was fun to see all the new technology. But again, this is another example of how the gap has closed significantly. When I was starting out, cheap LED lights was gonna get you cheap results. Skin tones never looked good. They had green casts or magenta casts, and the lights themselves barely had any output. That is not the case anymore. The color accuracy, even on the cheaper end of LEDs, has gotten really good. Now, is it gonna replace something like an HMI or a tungsten light? Probably not, but they come pretty darn close. That, mixed with the color pipeline and post-production, is gonna give you a really good result. It amazes me that there are lights that you can fit in your pocket, like the one behind me here, that come in at just $100 or $200. They have a ton of output, full RGB spectrum, and pretty accurate color. So again, lighting is another area of technology where you don't need the RE Sky panel anymore. You can get away with cheaper options that are almost just as effective. Now again, just like cinema cameras, I'm not trying to shun bigger expensive lights. On big sets, they absolutely have their place. But if you're new or you're trying to save up for a lighting package, I wouldn't be looking at things like sky panels. Look at companies like Neewer, Godox, and Amaran, because they're gonna give you awesome bang for buck. And last but not least, lenses. Now, when it comes to gear, lenses are the only thing where I don't think the gap could ever close. That's because lenses are just in a lane of their own. They all have their own look and their own character. Whether it's vintage, modern, spherical, anamorphic, the lenses you choose are definitely going to be what impacts your image the most. And of course, how you light your scenes. Every lens is going to have its own contrast, sharpness, distortion, and character, as well as the filters you may or may not decide to put in front of the lens. The lens is really your eye. That is how you are building your visual world and setting the tone for your project. Now, the cool thing is access to certain types of lenses is definitely becoming more available. When I was starting out, the only way to shoot anamorphic on a budget was something like the Russian Lomos. You could rent those off ShareGrid for maybe $400 or $500 a day, and they were massive. They had a really cool look to them, but if you were to buy a set of 3, it would have been something like $15,000. Now we have various companies, Blazar being kind of the most prominent, that are making extremely budget-friendly anamorphics, and getting some amazing looks out of them as well. Nothing about them feels cheap, including the character of the lenses themselves. But even with lenses, again, what happens in front of the camera is always going to matter more. It's funny because we're trying to constantly answer that question, how do you make your cinematography look more like a movie? The only actual true way to do it is to make a movie. You need to tell a story. We can do lighting setups and technical spec things for days, and it's super fun, but it's always gonna remain in the context of how to light a certain setup or a certain scene. What we're usually missing is the bigger context, that these scenes fit into a bigger project that we call a movie. So yes, gear matters because we need it to shoot the thing, but my advice to you would be worry less about gear and more about going and shooting the thing. Thanks for letting me wax poetic about gear, and I'll see you guys on the next one.